ado, please let me hand over to Ambassador John Craig from our friend and partner institution, the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Ambassador.
Good morning again to those of you in North America, and good afternoon to those tuning in from around the world. I'm Ambassador John Craig, a senior fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. The Transatlantic Leadership Network is a nonpartisan international network of practitioners, private sector leaders, and policy analysts dedicated to strengthening and reorienting transatlantic relations to the rapidly changing dynamics of a globalizing world. We engage government officials, parliamentarians, journalists, business executives, scholars, and other thought leaders on contemporary challenges to the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and the Gulf. The Transatlantic Leadership Network's energy program in particular has had many successes over the past several years. We established the annual Eastern Mediterranean Energy Leadership Summit in partnership with Samokis SA in Greece. The first summit, held in Athens, featured high-level participation from both the United States and the region. We look forward to continuing inclusive dialogue on Eastern Mediterranean energy issues in future summits. We launched a discussion on a by-the-book approach to maritime disputes, advocating for cooperation and peace building instead of fueling tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. This dialogue began with our publication, Maritime Disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, The Way Forward by Dr. Rudy Baroudi. This book is distributed by Brookings Institution Press and is now available in English, French, Greek, and Turkish. These developments, among others, are highlighted in our quarterly energy newsletters. We host monthly webinars dedicated to important energy issues. I encourage you to visit our website at www.transatlantic.org to stay up to date on our activities. And now I'll hand the microphone over to, so to speak, the microphone over to Howard and the Reverend Johnnie Moore to begin our program.
You're muted.
Thank you for that intervention. So thank you very much, John. And thank you to the Transatlantic Leadership Network for hosting this webinar. I'm Howard Covington. I'm one of the inception leads for the Scotia group. I'm also a scientist and a banker, and I chair the UK's National Institute for Artificial Intelligence, called the Alan Turing Institute. And that's why I get to wear a hoodie. I'm your co-host for this webinar, and I'll chair our discussion. So let me introduce our speakers. Firstly, my other co-host, evangelical leader, the Reverend Johnnie Moore. Johnnie is president of the Congress of Christian Leaders. Then our first champion, the Honourable Kirsty Duncan. Kirsty is deputy leader of the government in Canada's House of Commons. And our other champion, historian Niall Ferguson. Niall holds senior academic posts at Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford, and has recently published a book on the politics of catastrophe. We're all members of a group of leaders in politics, academia, law, and business called the Scotia Group. We couldn't be more different in our expertise and outlooks. What we have in common is a desire to do what we can to help make COP26 a great success. COP26, as I'm sure you all know, is this year's climate conference of the world's political leaders being held in Glasgow in November. This is the first of a series of public dialogues Scotia will be holding as its contribution to COP26. Let me try to set the stage. Humanity has an absolutely clear message from its scientists. We are at a crossroads. if we carry on burning fossil fuels the way we are doing, there is a huge risk that we will trigger changes that are geological in scale. If we do, in a few generations' time, the world will become hot, sour, stormy, flooded, burnt, and barren. And we can already see this change beginning. But we are a super smart species. We have the clean technologies that can solve the problem completely. What we don't have is time. And that's because our political leaders have done nothing but talk for the last 30 years. Emissions are still rising. To solve the problem, we now have to work like crazy at an energy transition. And this must be substantially done during this decade so that we can halve carbon emissions by 2030. Anything less than this, and COP26 will be another failure on the road to a hot, sour, stormy, flooded, burned, and barren world. The Biden administration clearly understands the urgency. To underline it, President Biden is holding a climate summit of 40 world leaders tomorrow. For the first time in 30 years, we might see real progress. We'd like to see the Biden team's efforts and COP26 being a great success. Here are a few ideas that might help. Firstly, Europe and China have great clean technologies, and the US could easily develop them. Why don't the EU and the US work together to package clean technologies, get their prices down even faster than they are already falling, and make them available to developing countries so that it becomes clear economic madness to build another coal-fired power plant or drill another oil well. Second, the EU is leading the world in pricing carbon and making plans for the carbon border tax that goes along with this. Rather than push against it, the US should help the EU to make the running on carbon pricing and then follow on when it can. Thirdly, the oil and coal producing countries must be cut into the deal, and they can be. This is the age of wind, solar, and hydrogen. There's a huge opportunity for countries that have grown rich on yesterday's dirty energy to grab a lead in today's clean energy. The US and the EU should help and encourage them to do that. Fourthly and lastly, talking doesn't cut it anymore. Pledges are no use without binding commitments. The world needs a coalition of the willing who will make legally binding commitments to cut emissions quickly. The coalition could include countries, cities, communities, and businesses. Now, the US probably can't make a commitment like this, and maybe China won't. But the EU and the UK could. So the US should encourage the EU and the UK to become global leaders in creating a framework for legally enforceable emissions targets. There you are, that's my pennyworth. Those are my 4 ideas, and that's all for me for the moment. Let me hand over to my co-chair, Johnnie Moore.
Thanks to Mr. Covington, Ambassador Craig, the extraordinary colleagues joining us. And of course, I'd like to thank everyone involved in organizing this event. And I especially appreciate efforts to engage unconventional voices, as COP26 in Glasgow will have a significant impact on everyone living in our world, whatever their politics or whatever their nuanced points of view are on climate change. And I certainly qualify as an unconventional voice, as an evangelical Christian, a business person, and a religious leader in the United States. Of course, the United States, like most Western and democratic countries, is living through an age of intense polarization. And one of the byproducts of polarization is the fortification of political and ideological silos. Our unique form of polarization is also a product of our digital age, where we've had no trouble innovating and coming up with new ideas. We are afforded the luxury in this digital age of self-selecting from the vast trove of information available to us. And we generally select what we agree with, and we generally select whom we want to hear it from. We like, in Facebook terms, what we want to hear, only to have more of that information automatically curated for us online by advertisers who chase us around the internet. And of course, we have the luxury of blocking those that we disagree with or those who criticize us. So too often in very important issues, life ends up becoming one grand exercise in listening to or preaching to our individual choirs. I've experienced it in my own life, as I very, very often meet in the business part of my life, the people who've never met an evangelical Christian before. There are 800 million evangelicals in our world, 10% of them in the United States. It's a third of the electorate in the United States. So the community contributes tens of billions of dollars to the economy. I'm not aware of a single noted evangelical that sits on the board of a single publicly traded company. And yet, it seems that consensus building is more important than ever. And yet, it is also not an exercise for the faint of heart on any issue, but especially on a politicized issue in a politicized time where almost nothing is nonpartisan anymore. So we have to settle for bipartisan agreement. And it takes real effort to build consensus. And that's what we're talking about in this webinar today. And in fact, it's impossible if one doesn't create on-ramps for diverse constituencies to join movements already in motion or conversations or debates which have already begun. You have to create on-ramps. And today we're discussing creating those on-ramps. And that's my responsibility to set that context. On-ramping is like sincerely welcoming a stranger to a dinner party of friends. First, the invitation must be issued. Secondly, they have to be welcomed by a host. Third, they have to be actively engaged to meaningfully contribute. And fourth, they have to be given permission to be different until there's chemistry in the diverse group sitting around the table, most of which already knew one another. And all along the way in this exercise, trust is built. And trust is the catalyst to action. And trust is also the most rare and valuable commodity in our world. The most valuable commodity in our world is not in the ground somewhere. It is trust. And issue-focused summits like COP26 succeed when they receive a certain minimally viable buy-in from the wide constituencies affected by their decisions. Prescriptive solutions generally fail. Free individuals have to be motivated by those solutions. So opportunities must be created for those who recognize the same challenges, but from different perspectives, or whose motivation to address those challenges may be varied, like in a soccer match. You know, some come to the game because they're zealous fans. I know something about soccer, being married to a Brazilian. Others, because it's their hobby. They just enjoy it. Others study the game. Some report on the game. Others still just come in order to profit from the enterprise. Many people can have many motivations to pursue the same interest. For instance, the summit can welcome the innovation and profit motivation of the private sector instead of just their commitment to corporate social responsibility, or for the cynics, virtue signaling. The summit can be stronger if it includes and doesn't expressly exclude those who will bring their vibrant, constructive criticism of the Paris Agreement. The summit can be a place where Wall Street and Main Street meet, where climate activists concerned about an apocalypse commingle with those who are agnostic about climate change, but perhaps even with narrow critiques of the science, but who are otherwise motivated by a common desire to drink clean water and to breathe clean air and enjoy clean oceans and to give that to future generations. It must be a place where the liberal consensus of internationalists, like most of us here today, doesn't collapse into an illiberal closed-mindedness that looks with derision upon those born between the proverbial coasts, to use an analogy for the United States. None of it will happen without intentionality, without creating on-ramps. And it cannot be a symbolic exercise in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And actually, substantive, diverse engagement with various interests is often the X factor. It's the catalyst for the progress that people are looking for in these issue-focused efforts. Take, for instance, my own community, the evangelical community. You know, some may be surprised to read Section 8 of the long-standing public policy document reflecting the consensus view of the board of the National Association of Evangelicals in the United States, on whose executive committee I serve. The document, called For Health of the Nation, includes an entire section on the responsibility for believing Christians to, quote, care for God's creation. It reads in part, we are called as followers of Jesus to embrace and act responsibly to care for God's earth, while we affirm the important truth that we worship only the Creator and not the creation. God gave the care of his earth and its species to our first parents. The responsibility has passed into our hands. We affirm that God-given dominion is a sacred responsibility to steward the earth and not a license to abuse the creation of which we are a part. We're not owners of creation. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the psalmist wrote. Christians acknowledge creation care as an act of discipleship, of spiritual growth. We're stewards of the earth, summoned by God to work it and to take care of it. We urge Christians in their personal lives and within their Christian community to live in creation-friendly ways by using energy efficiently and conserving resources and considering the environmental impact of purchases and experiencing the joy of contact with nature. And it goes on and on and on. See, producing a global consensus out of COP26 is more likely if we shatter these silos. You'll know, and we'll know if we've done it, when millions drive an electric car or some other technology because the free market has made it cool and cheap and practical, not necessarily because they wake up concerned about the end of the world. Or when religious leaders who worship a God who they believe intelligently designed a universe treat their world well simply because that's what they believe, because the good book tells them to. Or when Democrats and Republicans in the United States choose to have a conversation and won't settle for solutions that are simple, they won't settle for solutions that give a free pass to competitors or that involve vast sums of debt being passed on to future generations with no plan whatsoever, or total disregard for our federalist system. See, consensus builders make progress by creating on-ramps for those with diverse perspectives, and they never confuse the decision to act with the problem solving that must follow along the way. And with this mentality, we might actually solve this problem, reduce the controversy, depoliticize the conversation, and not leave anyone out along the way. Thank you.
Johnnie, thank you very much for that. Shattering silos and making things cool. I'm very much in favor of that. Before we go on, could I just welcome Her Majesty Queen Noor, our patron, who has joined us. You're very welcome, and we're very glad to have you here. And with that, let me move on to our first champion, Kirsty Duncan. Kirsty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Howard, and Your Majesty, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you to Professor Dahlin for his tremendous leadership in bringing us together and for his tireless advocacy for greater ambition and action on climate change. Howard, thank you for your message of urgency. Johnnie, thank you for your message of bringing us together. The timing of today's event is so important. Like many of you, I have been at this a long time, first as a scientist, then as the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, later as a member of Parliament and as Canada's former Minister of Science. We have 9 years to avert the worst consequences of the climate crisis. It's T minus 9 years. Let me repeat that, T minus 9. The problem is extremely urgent and we are not getting the job done. There can be no half measures, no wavering, because the reality is that even if we did everything that we said we were going to do when we signed up in Paris, the Earth's temperature would still rise by over 3 degrees Celsius. That's catastrophic. The reality is that the incremental path we have been on has not worked, and we need a transformational one. Tomorrow is Earth Day. It is also the day on which US President Biden will welcome heads of state for a virtual leader summit on climate. The summit is a key milestone on the road to COP26 in Glasgow, and the goal is to set the world up for success to address the climate crisis, emission reductions, finance, innovation, and job creation, and resilience and adaptation. World leaders will focus on raising climate ambition. And we are hearing how ambitious the US administration will be, how it plans to implement its cuts, and we await what other countries' plans are for enhanced climate action. We're coming together today in support of the COP26 process to make it meaningful, successful, and impact-driven by focusing on the post-Paris commitments. This means focusing on the institutional architecture that will deliver genuine change on the ground for communities and people around the world. In my role as an elected official, I work with and listen to young people in diverse communities across Canada and around the world. Our youth understand that countries aren't doing enough on climate change and that our collective action, or perhaps more accurately, inaction, has failed. It is their future, and they will live the consequences of climate change. Our youth see the urgency, the need to confront injustice and inequality, and the need to recover better from COVID-19. We need to hear their voice. The voices of girls, boys, non-binary, gender diverse youth, LGBTI youth, racialized and Indigenous youth, and youth of all abilities, not just in the streets, but here in conferences at COP26 and beyond. We need to listen to youth when they tell us that they suffer anxiety, distress, and grief about climate change. We not only need to offer them opportunities to advocate, to join a campaign, to lead, but young people ultimately need to hear that change has arrived, that this time is different, because this time has to be different. COVID-19 reminds us what a global challenge looks like, the urgency needed, and the ambition and action required. Youth in my life ask whether there's reason to hope. I start with the obvious. They give me hope. Our young leaders are so engaged, smart, caring, and passionate, and they're making change in their communities and countries right now. They ask for real, tangible hope. We need to say, our understanding is now greater than ever. Environmental laws have growing reach and cities are becoming greener. At least 155 United Nations member states now legally recognize that a healthy environment is a basic human right. We see the resumption of climate discussions between the United States and China. and world leaders are meeting tomorrow to increase their ambition. In 2020, we not only faced a continuing climate crisis, but also a global pandemic and deep injustice. 2020 was a year of tears and tragedies, and they continue. But 2020 also provides one overarching lesson, that we are one small planet with one human family, and that solidarity is our survival. But there are more lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. Countries listen to the science. Governments put in place detailed plans to protect the health and safety of their people. And there was understanding that we really are in this together, with international partners joining forces to guarantee COVID-19 vaccine access for the world, although vaccine equity remains our moral test. Imagine if we responded to climate change the way we responded to COVID-19. What would a global whole of society mobilization look like? Governments, companies, not-for-profits, civil society organizations, communities and individuals. Communities must be given a voice and the tools to take action. After all, community is where people live, work, and play. My interest is connecting the global climate crisis, government action plans, and much needed transformation of communities. We can fight climate change at the community level by building energy efficient and affordable housing, greening transit, planting trees, and so much more, and creating a better quality of life for all. In a wonderful, high-density urban community like the one I serve, planting fruit trees and gardens would not only reduce emissions, but would also feed our community. Communities need a basket of tools, including nature-based solutions and investments to take action on climate change and improve their environment and quality of life. And we must all ask what more the international community will do to help developing countries adapt to current and future climate impacts. Because we really are in this together. There is hope in the experience of cities, regions, and states, which are taking a lead on climate solutions. I spent 3 wonderful years at the University of Edinburgh, and the city and its people hold a very special place in my heart. And it has been so inspiring to watch Scotland take a leadership position on climate. They set ambitious targets for renewables and for greenhouse gas emissions just over a decade ago. Last year, renewables met 97% of Scotland's electricity needs, and their greenhouse gas emissions were 50% below 1990 levels. We can learn from each other and do this together. For 30 years, countries have come together to provide the science of climate change. For over 15 years, countries have negotiated and set targets. It's time to meaningfully include communities and give them the necessary funding and tools to take climate action. Glasgow in 2021 is the place to deliver concrete actions that deliver the finance, the technology, the jobs for a climate transformation. We need practical, positive climate action in communities around the world. And I'll just finish by saying it's time to accept the responsibility that has been handed to us.
Kirsty, thank you very much for that very strong message of hope and the message that we must embrace all communities and bring them together on this. Now, I'd like to hand over to our next champion, Niall Ferguson. Niall?
Thanks very much indeed, Howard, Your Majesty, ladies and gentlemen. Since 2013-14, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its 5th assessment report, the worst of its representative concentration pathways, RCP 8.5, has grown more, not less, probable, implying accelerating rises over this century in greenhouse gas emissions, temperatures, precipitation, and sea levels. The argument's been made that this is a slow-moving problem that can be addressed with affordable mitigation measures. That's Bjorn Lomborg's most recent book. But I think the uncertainties surrounding the future behavior of the complex system that is the world's climate argue strongly against the current combination of virtue signaling and procrastination. Fact. Today, 6 years after the Paris Agreement, only a handful of countries are on track to limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, let alone to meet the 1.5 degrees centigrade target that most scientists believe will help us to avoid the most severe climate disruption. I want to point to two fundamental problems that I think receive much too little attention in discussions on this subject. And here I want to draw on some of the arguments in my new book, which is the cheerful but rather Glaswegian title, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. The first one is the tendency of radical environmentalists to predict the end of the world, something that people have been predicting with diminishing credibility since the earliest human religions. Around 2030, the Swedish environmentalist Greta Thunberg has written, "We will be in a position to set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control that will lead to the end of our civilization as we know it. The world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change," the Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez prophesied in 2019. Thunberg's emergence as the personification of radical environmentalism recalls past forms of eschatology, not least in the severity of the sacrifices that she demands. We don't need a low carbon economy, she declared at the World Economic Forum back in January of last year. We don't need to lower emissions. Our emissions have to stop if we are to have a chance to stay below the 1.5 degree target. Any plan or policy of yours that doesn't include radical emission cuts at the source starting today is completely insufficient. Well, we saw exactly what that would look like in 2020, when lockdowns necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic did indeed achieve radical emission cuts, but at the cost of staggeringly high unemployment and social disruption. Apocalyptic prophecies coupled with unrealistic proposals don't help build the necessary political consensus for change. In fact, they encourage politicians to engage in virtue signaling and procrastination. The second point, the second inconvenient truth I'd like to talk about relates to China. Also last year, Xi Jinping, China's president, declared at the UN General Assembly that China would be carbon neutral by 2060. President Xi also pledged that China would hit peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030, though he didn't specify which year before 2030 that would be. Now, it's true that China leads the world in producing and installing wind turbines and solar panels. One hears that often mentioned. But China also relies on coal for nearly 60% of power production, accounting for about half of its carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels, according to the IEA. In 2020, Beijing approved coal-fired power plants at the fastest pace since 2015. Fossil fuels would need to fall to 25% of China's energy mix for it to reach a carbon neutral target, with the remaining emissions offset with carbon capture technologies. Here's another unfortunate fact. China accounts for 48% of all the global increase in CO2 emissions since the Paris Climate Agreement. very nearly half. Emissions in the EU peaked in 1987, in the US in 2005. American carbon emissions have kept falling and hit their lowest level since 1992 in 2019, and their lowest per capita level since 1950. Moreover, China contributes to increased CO2 emissions not only within its own borders. 72% of coal-fired plants under construction outside China rely on Chinese funding. John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, recently issued a joint statement with his Chinese counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, that they are, and I quote, committed to cooperating with each other and with other countries to tackle the climate crisis. Both countries, they said, will work, quote, to strengthen implementation of the Paris Agreement. However, it remains to be seen how serious the Chinese are about this. Some countries are asking China to do more on climate change, Deputy Foreign Minister Lei Yucheng said just last week. I am afraid this is not very realistic, end quote. The harsh reality is that climate policy can't be detached from the other issues that currently divide China and its allies from the US and its allies. Elsewhere, I've written about the fact that we already find ourselves in the early stages of Cold War II. Or perhaps, given the implications for the world of China's ongoing investment in fossil fuel technology, we should call this warm War One or warming War One. It seems very clear to me, at least, that China's implied timeframe for starting to reduce emissions only perhaps 8 years from now is insufficient. I'll leave it there.
Niall, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking account. We now come to questions and answers, but just before we do come to the question session, as we were making our preparations for this webinar, we received a video message from Prime Minister Tulepa of Samoa. And I think if Annie has got the technology, that we'd like to play that now. We can't hear Annie. Okay, we still can't hear Annie.
In Glasgow in November this year. As a Pacific Island leader, we continue to reaffirm that climate change represents the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. The Kainake 2 Declaration for Urgent Climate Change Action now calls on the international community to join the Blue Pacific to take bold and decisive and transformative action to address the challenges of climate change. We cannot allow COVID-19 to disrupt ambitious climate action. As forum leaders, we are committed to strong regional action, harnessing shared stewardship of the Pacific Ocean and acting as one Blue Pacific continent. These are vital to addressing the challenges facing the Blue Planet, to planning and owning our development agenda, and to building the resilience of the Pacific, particularly in the face of COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, the development of the 2050 Blue Pacific strategy for our Blue Pacific continent. This strategy will respond to our region's great challenges with climate change, the single greatest threat to the Blue Pacific. Samoa's enhanced climate change actions indicate our commitment to be part of the solution, despite our insignificant greenhouse gas emissions. In response to this call to action, the Samoa Climate Change Policy 2020 to 2030 was developed and approved to be part of our whole of society response. The policy will ensure there is effective and coordinated implementation of our climate change obligations at all levels. Samoa's ambition is reflected in it being part of the Science Not Silence campaign, promoting advocacy and actions in line with the findings of the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius special report. We are on track to meet our Paris Agreement target of 100% renewable ahead of schedule through an accelerated uptake of low emissions technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, hydropower, biomass, and biogas, and carbon neutral transportation. This is a seismic shift from diesel dependence to clean energy independence. Securing the climate financing needed to continue down this path would be extremely important, as the transition would be dependent on new and resilient infrastructure. Technology shifts towards green buildings, climate-proofed roads, and protection of local community assets. Our revised climate change policy offers a way forward for Samoa and provides a clear mandate for the national coordination of climate change policies and actions across the whole of our society. The policy provides the baseline for the evolution of national adaptation and mitigation targets, complements prevailing climate activities, and promotes a multidisciplinary and complementary approach, building upon relevant existing plans and programs, including our enhanced nationally determined contributions, NDC. Some of our adaptation and mitigation milestones include the integration of climate change into all sector plans. Climate strategies have been completed for agriculture, health, tourism, and forestry. The development of a Green Climate Fund and GEF-funded flood management control scheme for the Maisingano catchment area, which covers the Central Business District and includes infrastructural interventions, river walls to adapt to the rainfall patterns, as well as soft solutions such as payment for ecosystem services activities. The adoption of the community integrated management plans as adaptation intervention for district and community levels through the conservation of mangroves, marine ecosystems, forestry, water catchment, as well as hard solutions such as river and seawalls to respond to the severe impacts of climate change. All contribute to enhance resilience. Waste to energy has also been utilized to launch small-scale biogas systems in communities. The 2 million tree campaign to contribute to mitigating carbon being released in the atmosphere has been enhanced, and we have reached this target and beyond. Launching of the Afolau biomass gasification plant, 750 kW, to contribute to the renewable energy target set under the NDC for 100% RE by 2025. The plant utilizes invasive species for feedstock. Mr. Chair, we are aware that the global transition towards renewable energy and resilient infrastructure is beginning to happen, but not at the scale or the speed required to avert the worst effects of the climate crisis. We know that the biggest challenge in the fight against climate change is time. Samoa has joined the Island Resilience Partnership through Grid Market to address this issue through the utilization of Grid Market's predictive analytics, mapping technology, and competitive marketplace to design, develop, and deploy distributed energy resources for island nations. Through this partnership, we have achieved significant progress in the midst of the global pandemic and international lockdowns. Finally, we call on the international community to revise principles of development cooperation and create clear pathways to sustainable financing for developing countries to advance both the climate and the social agenda, and to ensure human capitals are protected against adversity, be it of climate, economic, or health origin. Global solidarity has been heavily tested under the COVID-19 pandemic, but it did bear fruits, and we are all now in the process of being immunized. A similar model should be adopted for the climate agenda to enable an effective and timely response. I thank you. Straightforward.
Thank you, Prime Minister Tulepa. There you have a message from the front line. It's happening, but it's not, the measures to offset climate change are happening, but not at a scale or fast enough to solve the problem from the front line. We're now at questions, and I know, because I've been looking at the chat, that Lord Howell has a question that he'd like to put. Rather than me reading it from the chat, Lord Howell, would you like to ask it directly? Is Lord Howell there? No.
There we are. Well done. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your fine introduction to this session. I must confess that I'm a fan of Professor Niall Ferguson's views on many issues, and we just heard from him before that very telling intervention from Samoa. We heard from him really the voice of sober realism about the whole issue, climate change, and the possibilities ahead. And what he had to say was, of course, even more reinforced by the International Energy Agency 2 days ago, when they reported an organization based in Paris, which actually I once chaired many in the last century. But their message was that global CO2 emissions are now set for their second biggest rise in history, are rising at a rapid rate, and are going to continue to rise, largely due to Asian and African coal burning through the 2020s and towards 2030 and 2040 and so on. They're rising when they should merely not be leveling, they should be falling. And to get anywhere near the Paris targets, anywhere near, they should be falling by at least 7.6%. So we have to really move on from the hopes and the feelings of emotion we all have to the real hard realities that the COP26 has got to achieve. And I'm just asking those experts around how they think we can begin to get a grip on the reality that China is producing 1,000 gigawatts of energy from coal. That's 1,000 from coal alone. And incidentally, for comparison, the total gigawatt output of the United Kingdom is about 54 gigawatts. So one can see the size of the problem there. How are we going to persuade the electorate, who are facing colossal expenditure as we go towards net zero in the advanced countries? Millions and millions of homes were going to be disrupted, tore out. gas boilers and so on, at huge trillion dollar costs. How are we going to persuade them to sustain all these costs when the trend of the overall emissions is going the wrong way? And people forget the aim is to get these emissions down. I ask the whole group here today how they think we should turn to that now. I hope they will realize that present policies are failing and the resources should be directed entirely, or almost entirely, to curbing and capturing and reusing the carbon emissions from the hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of coal-powered plants now in existence, now being built across the developing world. If we don't do that, then all our efforts to go green, all our endeavors, all our high feelings about low carbon lives and so on, less flying, less eating, less everything, all that is in vain. Let us have a bit of realism. How are we going to get the COP26 onto the realistic line?
Lord Howell, thank you. Thank you for posing that question. That is the nub of the problem, certainly. There are several other people who would like to raise questions or make points. Ambassador John Craig, I think, would like to make a point.
Thank you, Howard. In 1987, the world came together, developing countries and advanced economies, and they formed the Montreal Convention on ozone, the ozone problem. That effort is conceived or is perceived as a particularly successful effort. And I'm just wondering, is there a lesson we can learn from the Montreal Convention in terms of organizing effective efforts, the industrialized and advanced economies helping out the developing economies?
That is another wonderful question. What I'm going to do, because we're going to go on to another dialogue in a minute, is make a note of these questions, if I may, rather than try to get them addressed right at the moment. So let me gather in questions. Minister Tripathi, you have your digital hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think it's good to provide some geographical diversity in the mid. I'm very thankful to Professor Dalan, whom I know for the last 4 years, and University of Edinburgh. Speeches are quite impressive, and I really admired the speakers. But I've been there in the COPs, right? I attended the COP15, where we launched in Paris the International Solar Alliance, in COP16, COP17, COP18, COP19. Now, the Scotia, the SC26 must make a difference. And I think this has been correctly put now, and I'm very impressed those action points have been reached when we talked about energy efficiency, for example. So, I mean, a world full of LEDs, like India put in 350 million of LED bulbs and provided connectivity to some 26 million houses within a span of 18 months. It's not about one country, but I'm telling that, I was a student in Canada, and something I never understood, you have 26, a building with 26 floors, and the whole night the lights are on. I mean, offices, for example, I never understood as an Indian as to why at night in the top floors, the lights should be on. Still, I don't understand, Yeah. So if we talk about a world full of LEDs, I don't know what percentage we have, and I'm sure Professor Dalan, given the excellent orientation that he has, and I know him, it's going to come through. So my only suggestion was that very brilliant points have been raised from the speakers, and if we can raise SC26 will be famous if it doesn't become another sort of talking sessions that we usually have in COP. So what we can do is 3 things we have correctly identified: the institutions, the ideas, and the actors. So if we can develop an agenda about institutions, actors, and ideas. For example, one of the ideas we are talking about bringing down the cost of technology. It is not the first time we are talking about bringing down the cost of technology. There are hundreds of books, but it never comes down. Now, what International Solar Alliance has done, they are aggregating demand across countries for solar pumps, for 1 billion street lights, for 49 million home lighting systems. So if we identify a goods or a service or a commodity and somehow find a way of aggregating demand from across countries, that is one concrete way to bring down. For example, we have a question, how Scotland be at the heart of such institution and multilateral action? Well, we can have a directory of environmentally sound technologies, which can be identified. So to sum up, we should have 10 ideas around institutions that we are proposing, about the ideas that we are advocating, and the actors we are identifying. And I'm sure today brilliant points have been covered. So if I would volunteer to list out the points to Professor Laurence, because he had invited me to give a lecture in University of London long back, and I know him pretty well, and he is for it. So thank you. I think SC26, and today in Indian papers, it says that already, we have made 1.3 degrees, the last decade's average, the global mean temperature given to pre-industrial age. So only 0.2 is left. Now, whether the debate is still relevant, 1.5 is one more question we have to deal with. But I'm sure SC26 will survive many more COPs. And I still remember Wordsworth, who wrote that famous poem, The Stream. It says, men may come, men may go, but I go on forever. So it should not be that, COPs come, COPs go, but we go on forever. It should not be like that. Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Minister Tripathi, thank you very much. We have time for one last question. So Joe Puri, you have your digital hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much, Excellencies, Ambassadors, colleagues. Thank you very much for having me. So as we think about how we want to anticipate our future, I think it's also important to think about and realize that, of course, Paris, and I'm going to submit this very humbly because I know all of you know more than me on this topic, is really about imagining a future which is not just low emissions, but it's also climate resilient. And I'm making the distinction because I do think that as we think about a future, and we have to realize that at least during our common lifetimes, we are never going to be able to realize diminished temperatures. So whether it's the representative concentration pathways of 4.5 or 8.5, we will be essentially investing for the future. But at the same time, it is important for us to think about a climate resilient present, and also to then direct our efforts while we think about carbon taxes, technologies, reducing their prices, to also be thinking about livelihoods today and climate resilience today, and really thinking about the smallholder farmers, the people living in developing countries who are dealing with climate variability and uncertainty today. So as we think about the huge amount of financial flows that are getting redirected or repurposed, or we are thinking about stranded assets, and we are thinking about what to do about mitigation, I think it is almost as important, if not more, to also think about resilience today and adaptation today, because adaptation is within our reach. With redirected financial flows, we can, and I'm only going to talk, going to mention the number for developing countries. That number, that need in terms of annual need of developing countries globally is about $300 billion. That's within reach. What you need for mitigation is approximately 1.5 trillion. So that's an order of magnitude. And so as we go along, I think it would be really useful to also parse what the scenarios could look like and how we redirect our efforts. Thanks.
There we are, adaptation. Thank you so much for bringing that up. We are close to our time. In fact, we're right on it. So let me bring things to a close. I'd like to thank our speakers, Johnnie Moore, Kirsty Duncan, and Niall Ferguson, for the amazing scope of the views that they've expressed, and indeed for the excellent comments we've just heard from the floor. In the Scotia group, we see ourselves very clearly at T-9 years, with the clock ticking furiously towards 2030. That's the year by which emissions need to be halved and the energy transition needs to be much, much further advanced. Our plan is to draw on the ideas raised in these dialogues and put together some concrete proposals for action. At the back of our minds is the creation, if you like, of a global top tier of those who are willing to commit to doing what it takes to solve the the climate crisis once and for all. We're highly supportive of COP26, but we don't want to be just another voice. We really want to find solutions that will make COP26 transformational. So thank you everyone for being with us. For those of you joining the Majlis discussion session, let me invite you to drop off this Zoom call and to pick up the next one. And to everybody, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.